everywhere. GBS.
Good afternoon. Welcome to The Ambassador, where we debunk global diplomacy and geopolitics. With me, your Ambassador Susan Nganga. Today, we shift our focus to the upcoming G20 summit, a missing superpower, a rising coalition, and a continent poised for a pivotal moment. Does the upcoming G20 signal a new world order as BRICS challenge the status quo? Where does Africa fit in this high-stakes game of global economic chess? We are diving deep into the power plays that will shape our continent's future. But first, let's look at stories making headlines today. The Democratic Republic of Congo has placed $5 billion bounty on the heads of 3 M23 rebel leaders who have been linked to the ongoing violence in the country's volatile eastern region. Despite the reward, the likelihood of capturing these figures remains uncertain as M23 continues to hold significant territory with the support of neighboring Rwanda. Here's more on that scene.
The DRC Congo government is offering a $5 million reward for the capture of 3 high-profile M23 leaders, former electrical chief Corneille Nangaa, military commander Sultani Makenga, and political leader Bertrand Bisimwa. The trio was sentenced to death in absentia last year for treason. This announcement, however, comes amidst a worsening security situation in the country's eastern provinces, where M23 rebels, backed by Rwandan troops, control key cities such as Goma and Bukavu. The fighting has claimed the lives of thousands and displaced hundreds of thousands more. President Felix Tshisekedi has called for international sanctions against Rwanda, accusing it of providing military support to the M23 rebel group. With mineral resources vital for global technology, the conflict has far-reaching implications. The DRC government has urged the United States to source minerals directly from its territory rather than from Rwanda, which it accuses of smuggling essential materials like gold and coltan. For now, it remains uncertain whether the $5 million reward will lead to the capture of these rebel leaders, as the situation in the eastern provinces continues to evolve, with both sides entrenched in a deadly conflict over control of strategic cities and resources. Reporting for GBS News, Irene Juguna.
Violent protests broke out in Bucharest after far-right populist Călin Giurgescu was barred from running in Romania's May presidential election rerun. The ban followed the annulment of last year's election results, where he had emerged as the front-runner amid claims of Russian interference. He vowed to appeal the decision, calling it a blow to democracy.
Violent protests erupted Central Election Bureau in Bucharest after far-right populist Călin Giurgescu was banned from participating in the return of May's presidential election. Presence of his supporters clashed with riot police, leading to the use of tear gas and resulting in overturned cars and smashed windows. The unrest was triggered by the Central Electoral Bureau's decision to reject Giurgescu's candidacy, citing his violation of legal obligations and failure to defend democracy. This ruling came after last year's first round of elections, where Giurgescu had emerged as the front-runner, was annulled following intelligence revelations that Russia had used over 800 TikTok accounts to back his campaign. Giurgescu has been a vocal critic of Romania's involvement in NATO and the EU, comparing the decision as a direct blow to democracy and vowed to appeal the ruling. His rise to prominence based on promises to restore Romania's dignity and sabotage with international organizations has already sparked controversy. In February, he was arrested on charges of attempting to overthrow constitutional order and links to an fascist group, accusations which he denies. Despite these challenges, Dubrovsko's pro-Russian views, including pledging to end support for Ukraine if elected, have drawn international attention with support from figures like US Vice President Vance and Elon Musk. Chizatiano, GBS News.
In Syria, violent clashes between loyalists of former President Bashar al-Assad and the country's new Islamic rulers have escalated, leaving over 1,000 people dead, mostly civilians. As the fighting continues in the Assad's coastal stronghold, Syria's interim president, Ahmed Shara, vowed to hold those responsible for the bloodshed accountable. The violence has sparked fears of a new civil war, further destabilizing a region already devastated by years of conflict. Here is more on that.
The violence in Syria's coastal region has entered its fourth day, with the conflict now claiming over 1,000 lives. Most of the casualties have been civilians, with numerous others from Assad's loyalist forces and Islamist factions. Interim President Ahmed al-Shara condemned the violence, accusing remnants of the Assad regime and their foreign supporters of instigating the unrest. He vowed that no one will be above the law and promised to investigate the killings, calling for national unity in the face of the growing insurgency. The violence, especially in the areas like Latakia, has sparked widespread fear. Reports of mass executions, including the killing of civilians from the Assad Alawite sect, have surfaced, and both the pro-Assad insurgents and the Islamist government have been blamed for the atrocities. As forces loyal to the new Islamist leadership clash with the insurgents and former military personnel, the situation remains volatile. This escalation follows a period of calm after Assad's ousting, but the brutal crackdown on his loyalists has reignited the cycle of revenge killings. International calls for justice have intensified, and both the United States and the UN have urged Syria's interim leadership to hold the perpetrators accountable for their actions. The ongoing violence in Syria underscores the fragility of the country's fragile political landscape. With thousands dead and communities torn apart, the quest for justice and accountability remains elusive. The international community faces the critical challenge of supporting efforts to stabilize the region, while ensuring that those responsible for the killings are held to account. The future of Syria remains uncertain as the country grapples with the consequences of years of conflict and the deepening divisions among its people. This is Abdi Hamid Ali, GBS News.
Russian forces have launched a significant offensive to reclaim territories in the West Kursk region, which had been taken by Ukraine troops during a surprise assault last summer. Reports indicate that the new offensive is well underway, with Russian forces intensifying their efforts along multiple fronts. The situation is rapidly evolving, with the Ukraine forces now facing increasing pressure in the region. Here is more on that scene.
Over the weekend, Russian troops began a large-scale offensive aimed at retaking the western Kursk region from Ukrainian forces. This follows a series of successful Ukrainian incursions into the area last summer, which surprised many. Military action is taking place across multiple fronts, with Russian forces making significant advances. The situation in the region appears to be rapidly escalating, with pro-Russian sources reporting a significant Russian assault on the town of Sudza, located near the Ukrainian border. Ukrainian forces are in critical condition as they face an intense onslaught. Russian airborne brigades and motorized rifle regiments are heavily involved in the battle. The recapture of several villages was confirmed by the Russia's defense ministry. The offensive comes at a time when Ukraine's position is further complicated by a pause in US military aid and growing international pressure for a ceasefire. As the battle for the Kursk region intensifies, the shifting dynamics on the front line highlights the ongoing volatility of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. With Ukrainian forces on the defensive mode and facing mounting pressure,
The course of this new offensive could have far-reaching consequences for the overall conflict. The pause in the US military aid only adds to the uncertainty, raising questions about the future of Ukraine's defense strategy and the broader international response to the war. This is Abdihamid Ali, GBS News.
And that's all for now on our segment. We'll be right back after this break from the African In-Depth. Stay tuned.
Today, it's that day that I would like us just to have that conversation on monthly matters.
Let's talk of Mama Fua, who like akifanya shughuli zake hapa kule has more or less that amount.
Yeah, so on that part, I would say this. When you are doing your savings, you can have, we normally talk about having 3 buckets. So we will just talk about income, budgeting, saving, and investment. Those are the 4 areas we will look at.
Happens to those like me who are planning to retire early.
We are basically looking at our incomes. We also talk about savings and investment. So those are the 3. I will not add the 4th one, which we all shy of talking about. So I would say it's not how much I am earning, but it is how much I set aside. So
hello kids! Did you know a year has 31,557,600 seconds? Why do you think so? Exactly. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 365 days in a year. We count the extra 0.25 because of leap year. When you multiply all these numbers together, you get a huge number of seconds. That's why a year feels long, but time still flies when you are having fun.
What is always before you but can't be seen?
Kudiscover talent.
Kudiscover ulijuangaje like unaweza imba like yeah.
Kini Trace Jumi Kipchoge kwa ngoma na mfala wanani dis na wanabonga kwa ngoma, mafanjo wananipenda ndo nazidi kwa roga, wenye walenjaribu manze walishachoka na nikozabe meditation naendelesha generation niliofanya
Wewe at 1 year old ulikuwa unafanya nini? You're feeling the vibe. Ulitoa a few days ago, unaweza taka utuambie like ulikuwa unafikiria nini when you came up with the lyrics? Yeah.
So I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing. And if you're tryna win, you can be on my team. Yeah, so I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing.
You feel like you're young at heart, I'm an old soul. If you could only listen to one singer or band for the rest of your life, who will you choose?
And the question of the day is, can you survive without internet?
Ngumu. Plus kwa chile hizo story tu zote zikupite ni ngori.
Niwaambie ukweli. Like hii ni kama kuambia mtu mwenye alikuwa amezoea kushindana nguo, mwambie toa nguo ushinde uchi. Hiyo huku atriki kwa sababu sasa like ilikuwa imekuingia kwa kichwa kabisa.
Sasa unaweza kaa holi ya bila simu.
Kuspend hii most of the time kwa simu. Also you need to run skills. So nilipatana na later hapa nikapply huko. And then I started learning skills. Digital skills.
Yes, hadi siku mbili haiwezi.
Kwa wiki naachilia hata kama ni siku mbili ama sometimes na extend to wiki nzima. Napata shiki simu yangu.
Water remains to be the world's most precious commodity, but is the most misused. In times of drought, saving water is the only solution to making sure you have it. Don't use the shower when water is scarce. Instead, use the basin while bathing. Repair all leaking taps and pipes. Wash your car only whenever necessary. If not, use a piece of cloth to wipe it clean. Do not use the hose pipe to water your garden. Instead, use the water you clean your vegetable with to water your flowers. Do not release wastewater into rivers. Note that your downstream is someone else's upstream. Of all the waters available on Earth, only 1% is fit for human consumption. Every drop counts.
Today, it's that day that I would like us just to have that conversation on monthly matters.
Let's talk of Mama Fua, who like akifanya shughuli zake hapa kule has more or less that amount.
Yeah, so on that part, I would say this. When you are doing your savings, you can have, we normally talk about having 3 buckets. So we will just talk about income, budgeting, saving, and investment. Those are the 4 areas we will look at.
Happens to those like me who are planning to retire early.
We are basically looking at our incomes. We also talk about savings and investment. So those are the 3. I will not add the 4th one, which we all shy of talking about. So I would say it's not how much I am earning, but it is how much I set aside. So
Hello, kids. Did you know a year has 31,557,600 seconds? Why do you think so? Exactly. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 365 and 25 days in a year. We count the extra 0.25 because of leap year. When you multiply all these numbers together, you get a huge number of seconds. That's why a year feels long, but time still flies when you are having fun.
What is always before you but can't be seen?
Kudiscover talent.
Kudiscover. Ulijuangaje like unaweza imba like
Kini Trace Jumi Kipchoge kwa ngoma na mfala wanani dis na wanabonga kwa ngoma, mafanjo wananipenda ndo nazidi kwa roga, wenye walenjaribu mazee walishachoka na nikozabe meditation naendelesha generation niliofanya
Wewe at 1 year old ulikuwa unafanya nini? You're feeling the vibe. Ulitoa a few days ago, unaweza taka utuambie like ulikuwa unafikiria nini when you came up with the lyrics?
So I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing. And if you're tryna win, you can be on my team. Yeah, so I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing.
You feel like you're young at heart, I'm an old soul.
Hiyo huku atriki kwa sababu sasa like ilikuwa imekuingia kwa kichwa kabisa.
Sasa unaweza kaa holi ya bila simu.
Kuspend hii most of the time kwa simu. Also you need to run skills. So nilikutana na place hapa nikapply huko. And then I started learning skills. Digital skills.
Yes, hadi siku mbili haiwezi.
Kwa wiki naachilia hata kama ni siku mbili ama sometimes na extend to wiki nzima. Napata shida simu yangu.
Water remains to be the world's most precious commodity, but is the most misused. In times of drought, saving water is the only solution to making sure you have it. Don't use the shower when water is scarce. Instead, use the basin while bathing. Repair all leaking taps and pipes. Wash your car only whenever necessary. If not, use a piece of cloth to wipe it clean. Do not use the hose pipe to water your garden. Instead, use the water you clean your vegetable with to water your flowers. Do not release wastewater into rivers. Note that your downstream is someone else's upstream. Of all the waters available on Earth, only 1% is fit for human consumption. Every drop counts.
Everywhere. GPS.
Welcome back to the bulletin now. There are growing international concerns over escalating tensions in South Sudan, where recent clashes between forces loyal to the president and the first vice president are threatening the fragile peace that has held since the 2013 civil war. As violence flares in the Upper Nile state, there are fears that the country could be on the brink of renewed civil war. Syria, violent clashes between loyalists of former President Bashar al-Assad and the country's new Islamic rulers have escalated, leaving over 1,000 people dead, mostly civilian, as the fighting continues in Assad's coastal stronghold. Syria's interim president, Ahmed Shara, vowed to hold those responsible for the bloodshed accountable. The violence has sparked fears of a new civil war, further destabilizing a region already devastated by years of conflict.
The latest violence in South Sudan, particularly in the northeastern Upper Nile state, has raised alarms about the stability of the country's unity government. The coalition between President Salva Kiir and first Vice President Riek Machar has been on shaky ground, with recent clashes between their forces deepening divisions within the ruling coalition. The peace agreement that led to the formation of the current unity government in 2018 was hailed as a critical step in ending devastating 5-year civil war that claimed nearly 400,000 lives. As fears mount that the situation could spiral into a full-blown civil war, the United States has ordered all non-emergency staff to leave the country, urging citizens to reconsider travel to South Sudan. A travel advisory issued by the U.S. on Sunday said
all now for our current segment. We'll be right back after this short break.
Today, it's that day that I would like us just to have that conversation on monthly matters.
Let's talk of Mama Fua, who like akifanya shughuli zake hapa kule has more or less that amount.
Yeah, so on that part, I would say this. When you're doing your savings, you can have, we normally talk about having 3 buckets. So we will just talk about income, budgeting, saving, and investment. Those are the 4 areas we will look at.
Happens to those like me who are planning to retire early.
We are basically looking at our incomes. We also talk about savings and investment. So those are the 3. I will not add the 4th one, which we all shy of talking about. So I would say it's not how much I am earning, but it is how much I set aside. So
Hello, kids. Did you know a year has 31,557,600 seconds? Why do you think so? Exactly. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day and 365 days in a year. We count the extra 0.25 because of leap years. When you multiply all these numbers together, you get a huge number of seconds. That's why a year feels long, but time still flies when you are having fun.
What is always before you but can't be seen?
Kudiscover talent ama
Kudiscover ulijuangaje like unaweza imba like
kini Trace Jumi Kipchoge kwa ngoma na mfala wanani dis na wanabonga kwa ngoma mafanjo ananipenda ndo nazidi kwa roga wenye walenjaribu mazee walishachoka na nikozabe meditation naendelesha generation niliofanya kalki.
Wewe at 1 year old ulikuwa unafanya nini? You're feeling the vibe. Ulitoa a few days ago, unaweza taka utuambie like ulikuwa unafikiria nini when you came up with the lyrics?
So I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing. And if you're tryna win, you can be on my team. So I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm tryna boss, let me do my thing.
You feel like you're young at heart, I'm an old soul. If you could only listen to one singer or band for the rest of your life, who will you choose?
And the question of the day is, can you survive without internet?
Ngumu. Plus kwa chile hizo story tu zote zikupite ni ngori.
Niwaambie ukweli. Like hii ni kama kuambia mtu mwenye alikuwa amezoea kushindana nguo, mwambie toa nguo ushinde uchi. Hiyo huku atriki kwa sababu sasa like ilikuwa imekuingia kwa kichwa kabisa.
Sasa unaweza kaa holi ya bila simu.
Kuspend hii most of the time kwa simu. Also you need to run skills. So nilipata na later hapa nikapoapply huko. And then I started learning skills. Digital skills.
Yes, hadi siku mbili haiwezi.
Kwa wiki naachilia hata kama ni siku mbili ama sometimes na extend tu wiki nzima. Napata shiki simu yangu.
Water remains to be the world's most precious commodity, but is the most misused. In times of drought, saving water is the only solution to making sure you have it. Don't use the shower when water is scarce. Instead, use the basin while bathing. Repair all leaking taps and pipes. Wash your car only whenever necessary. If not, use a piece of cloth to wipe it clean. Do not use the hose pipe to water your garden. Instead, use the water you clean your vegetable with to water your flowers. Do not release wastewater into rivers. Note that your downstream is someone else's upstream. Of all the waters available on Earth, only 1% is fit for human consumption. Every drop counts.
Everywhere, GBS.
Welcome back now. The absence of the United States in the coming G20 summit raises questions about its role in economic governance and the growing influence of BRICS. But is Washington's withdrawal purely ideological, or are there deeper strategic interests at play? As BRICS expand, could it surpass the G20? And what does this mean for Africa? Does BRICS truly serve developing economies, or is it driven by geopolitical ambitions, with Africa balancing between these blocs? The quick question remains, what policy best serves its future? To unpack this, we turn to Dr. Josh Mayo and our correspondent Peres Kigo. But first, let's take a listen to Peres Kigo report on the global power shifts.
The absence of the United States in the recent G20 summit has raised critical concerns about global leadership and economic coordination. As the world's largest economy, the United States plays a central role in shaping global financial policies, trade regulations, and diplomatic efforts. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio both skipped a high-profile international summit, raising questions about Washington's stance on global cooperation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent cited prior commitment in the United States as the reason for his absence. However, the more direct criticism came from the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who dismissed the event agenda altogether. Rubio took an even stronger stance against the November meeting, pledging that he would not attend, and dismissing South Africa's theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability.
It is vital to ensuring that the rights and interests of the vulnerable are not trampled beneath the ambitions of the powerful. Multilateral cooperation is our only hope of overcoming unprecedented challenges, including slow and uneven growth, rising debt burdens and levels.
Its non-attendance is gradually creating a vacuum to allow emerging economies, particularly BRICS members, to push for alternative financial systems and greater influence. This absence underscores broader geopolitical tensions, signaling potential shift in power dynamics that could redefine international economic governance. For Africa, this shift presents both opportunities and challenges. The United States absence may accelerate BRICS' agenda of reducing dependence on Western financial institutions, potentially offering African nations more diverse economic partnerships. However, without strong U.S. engagement in the G20, key global economic decisions may lack consensus, affecting trade policies, debt relief efforts, and sustainable development goals.
Welcome back, Dr. and Peres, to the bulletin. Now we are seeing the upcoming G20 summit, Peres, in November in South Africa. Can you tell us what is the G20 summit? Give us like an overview of the summit, Peres.
Okay, thank you, Susan. When you look at the G20 summit, this is an annual gathering meeting of leaders from the world's largest 20 economies. It acts as a platform bringing together countries representing GDP, that is the gross domestic product, at 5%, and also representing 75% of the global trade, and also representing 2/3 of the world's population. When you look at the G20 summit, it was formed in 1899. And the reason for its formation, it was formed so that it can solve economic issue and financial crisis, and also to promote international trade, and also to look the issues of the climate action and sustainability, and also the issues of debt relief. And when you look at the G summit, it usually rotates annually. And each year, a member or a country, let's say like Brazil or Canada, take the presidency. Like in 2023, India took the presidency. Yes. In 2024, Brazil took the presidency. And now in 2025, South Africa have taken the chairmanship. Yes.
Dr. Give us an overview of the summit also.
Well, as I think Peres has given a very comprehensive overview of the G20, starting with the historical formation, its key areas of concern, and the governance framework, the rotational presidency. What I can highlight is the evolving nature of the G20 over time vis-a-vis the G7. Which initially was a G8, including Russia and the major economies of the world. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, initially in about 2014 and annexed Crimea, which is a province of Ukraine, the G8 temporarily, or let me say indefinitely, suspended Russia. So the G8 became G7. But why did the G20 come along? G20 came along because of criticism that the G8 was representing the old balance of power of the colonial powers, generally speaking, and it was perpetuating the inequalities in the United Nations structure, particularly the Security Council, which basically constitutes countries that were the major powers during the Second World War. And that this imbalance represented the continuous dominance of Western powers, both at the UN, but also in the global financial architecture, representing the powers that they have in the World Bank and the IMF. So this continued criticism led to the creation of the G20 as an expansion of G7/G8. Over time, the G7 or 8, whichever way you like it, has declined significantly, and correspondingly, the G20 significance has risen over time. So that explains the history why actually the G20 came about, and why it is believed to still be a relevant intergovernmental framework for dealing with global issues, particularly economic and financial issues, as Paris has said, and also other emerging global challenges, for example, climate change and COVID-19, as it has been mentioned.
South Africa is the first African country to actually hold the presidency of the G20. Does this signal a shift in Africa's role in the international affairs?
It is not just the first country to host the summit. It is actually the only country in the G20. When India was chairing the G20, they presided over the admission of the African Union because the EU, the European Union, was already a member of G20. And I think there was a realization that the G20 is not really that inclusive if you just have one country from the whole of the African continent. And so they thought, what is the best way to do this? Of course, many countries would be jostling to be included in the G20 from the African continent, but I guess the feeling there was a compromise that rather than picking other countries, because Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, for example, were jostling for that inclusion, it was perhaps perceived that a best way to achieve this target was to have the African Union, which would represent all the African states. So now South Africa, as the only country that is a member state of the G20, it is perceived that it is now the turn for South Africa to host its chairmanship. The challenge is that South Africa is assuming the leadership of the G20 at a critical time in the global international sphere, namely the rise of Donald Trump and the significant shift in the orientation of the United Nations in relation to international global governance, how countries deal with global issues, and the concept known as multilateralism, which is the way in which countries work together in a cooperative spirit to solve global challenges. Trump doesn't believe in that. Trump believes somehow that multilateralism, so these global institutions of dealing with global problems, tends to work against the interests of the US. That is the belief of the Trump administration, particularly Trump himself. But the US in the past has actually seen the value of multilateralism in advancing US interests, that these global institutions give the US a platform to push its global agenda and use these platforms to advance US interests, whether it is trade, whether it's international security, whether it's great power, influence, and also a means to control China, right? So this is how the US has worked using international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the G20, and even the G8. It had used to expand its power and tried to diminish the role of China and Russia and other emerging powers. But Trump sees it the other way, that rather than advance US interest, it actually works against US interests. Not many American diplomats and leaders see that, but Trump is currently the most powerful person in the world, so they all line up behind him. And that poses challenges for not just NATO, the United Nations. We've seen Trump pulling out of the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, and also this reluctance to engage with the G20 is a further demonstration of the US withdrawing from multilateral organizations. So it puts a challenge to the whole of the G20 and particularly South Africa in how do you pursue a G20 agenda without the presence of the US.
So that was the main reason the United States say they'll not be attending the G20 this year.
That is the primary reason, although it added another twist. The twist is that South Africa holds the presidency, and therefore the summits will be held in South Africa. The summit that preceded was the summit of the foreign ministers and the trade ministers. Remember, when the G20 first started, it was formed in 1999. It was initially a forum for finance ministers and foreign ministers to deal with global issues. But when the global financial crisis happened in 2007, it was elevated into a forum for heads of state, so the presidents. That is why the presidents held the first heads of state summit in 2008. Sometimes it's confusing. Why was the G20 started in 1999, but they held their first heads of state summit 10 years later? It is because it was elevated from a ministerial conference to a heads of state conference in 2008. So the issue now so the earlier meeting, it is usually preceded by a foreign ministers and finance ministers meeting, and then the heads of state meeting, which is scheduled to take place in November. And the US has already signaled that they will not participate. So this is, of course, the challenge, the twist, as I said, with South Africa is that, one, the most influential advisor of Donald Trump is Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a South African, well, born in South Africa. He's a South African American, although he prefers to say, I am an American, period. But of course, he has his history in South Africa. His father still lives in South Africa. Elon Musk is perceived to, his ideology is white supremacist or white racist position in relation to the racial politics in South Africa. And then you have the racial politics of land in South Africa, where majority of the land, up to 80 or maybe now 70%, is owned by white people. Black South Africans were dispossessed of their land during the occupation of the whites in South Africa. So since black majority rule from the days of Mandela, the South African government has been trying to find a formula to redistribute land away from whites to majority black people. This is very political. They did not, because Zimbabwe tried that, and it led to a lot of violence, a lot of killings, it led to sanctions, and it collapsed the economy. South Africa is trying to prevent that by using its compulsory acquisition, but the government is paying the whites to give up their land so that it's given to blacks. But this has been political. It has not progressed as quickly as many South Africans want. So they still claim that we still live in an economic apartheid, where the whites still control the economy. So Donald Trump has this agenda of promoting white superiority. So they perceive the policies of the South African government as being anti-white. So they are saying it's racist against the whites. And you can see the policies of the US, the Trump administration is getting rid of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So they argue that this land distribution in South Africa is working against the white people, and Trump is now a champion of white superiority. So they are using that extra twist to say that South Africa is advancing anti-Americanism. But most crucially is South Africa's opposition to Israel in the Gaza conflict. South Africa was primarily responsible for bringing Israel to the International Criminal Court, which has sued Israel, and the International Criminal Court has released a warrant of arrest against Netanyahu and the army general. South Africa also sued Israel in the International Court of Justice. That Israel was perpetuating human rights atrocities. The court has ruled against Israel. So, but of course, Israel is the biggest ally of the US in the Middle East. So Trump sees South Africa as working against its core interests in the Middle East and its support for Israel, and so it sees South Africa as working against the US interest, and so it compounds the whole situation.
So are we seeing a permanent withdrawal of the United States?
We don't know that yet, but I will not be surprised if when it comes to the heads of state summit in November that the US has signaled that it will not attend, that it might actually pull out of the G20. It is very likely. With Trump now, anything can happen, and we should not be surprised if that happens.
So you're working with an if it pulls out right now?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. So Paris, if the United States shifts away from the G20, will the G20 become less relevant?
Yes, according to me, it's going to become less relevant. Because first of all, when you look at the formation of BRICS, the South Africa, when you look at this, the same member who are in the G20, they're also in BRIC, the BRICS. And you know, BRIC was established in 2001, but it was formally established in 2009. So when you look at the members who are in the G20 summit are the same member who are in the BRIC summit, like Brazil, India, China, South Africa. So for me, I see like in times to come, G20 is going to diminish because South Africa already in the BRIC summit. And you know, for me, I see the formation of the BRIC summit is to counterbalance the G20. For me, that's how I view it. Because we know the BRIC summit, they are non-Western nations, you see? And they are trying to shift away from cooperation with the Western nation, you see? So for me, I think within time, G20 is going to diminish.
Do you agree with her?
It remains contentious because China has often adopted a strategy where when the US pulls out of an international organization, China steps up to take the leadership role because they are the two major powers and they are competing. We have seen this with China increasing its influence in the World Health Organization, for instance, taking bold steps in climate change, and so on and so forth. So Paris is quite right that BRICS was set up to counter the dominance of the US, particularly through the G20. And as we might see later, BRICS have also developed other financial mechanisms and institutions to try to counter the power of the IMF and the World Bank, which are seen to be dominated by the US. But if the US exits the G20, the natural superpower, so to say, is China. So global leadership does not thrive in a vacuum. There always has to be a dominant power that plays a role. If the US retreats with its America First agenda, China increasingly becomes dominant. And the question then is China likely then to play a more influential role in the G20? Remember that Russia is a member of G20, China is a member, and other also the same members of BRICS. So China and Russia together and other states, with the absence of the US, the European Union is not very powerful, and the European Union also prefers to have a good relationship with China. So we are at least, at the very minimum, we are likely to see the increasing dominance of China and an increasing influence of China in policy making as far as the G20 is concerned. We know that Trump and the US, they are not interested in climate issues, in issues of equity, debt relief, and so on and so forth. They are not interested in equitable trade. Trump is now waging a trade war. But the interest of all the other G20 countries actually align without the US. So G20 might continue to advance its agenda with all the other members contributing because their agenda align. Trump's situation is not permanent, right? He will probably be in office for 4 years. We will probably have a more, a leader in the US that is more interested in international cooperation. The same way that we saw the back and forth shift when Biden came into office, the next American leader is probably likely to increase or enhance their presence in the G20. So even if it's a withdrawal, it will not be permanent. So the death of the G20 is probably not likely to happen anytime soon.
We talked about China, right? So what are some of the implications if this vacuum is created for Africa and someone like China takes up? Because China has been giving a lot of debt to Africa, right? So what are some of the implications it has on Africa, Dr.
Well, in the G20, there hasn't been very visible benefits to Africa as such. Because as we said, only South Africa was a member.
Yes.
And so even whenever there are G20 summits, Africa doesn't really warm up to it because they don't clearly see a relevance to it. Many African states see their relevance in the United Nations General Assembly and other UN and forums. So increasingly they see that the G20 was just a token statement that yes, we value other countries, but the pivot was more to Asia and the Middle East, but not so much to Africa, even though we have the African Union sitting in that. So generally speaking, Africans and Africa does not see the value of G20 as such. So whether the US pulls out or not, the effect is not felt significantly. It might be felt, however, in terms of resources, because the US was a significant contributor to the agreements arrived at in the G20, for example, particularly during the financial crisis. Because if the global crisis, financial crisis is solved, Africa will benefit. Issues to do with international trade, Africa would benefit from that. But Africa generally benefits through bilateral agreements, for example, with the European Union, with countries in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. The opposite, though, is what happens with the BRICS, where China has much more influence, and Russia and other countries. So BRICS formed the New Development Bank. They also formed an alternative credit arrangement where African countries can borrow money from this credit facility to balance their budgets, and the New Development Bank to provide loans for infrastructure and so on and so forth. So if the G20 declines with less money coming from the US and generally the other countries catching a cold and not investing so much, it will lead to the relative strength of the BRICS, particularly with the expansion to include new countries. We see Ethiopia and Egypt are members of BRICS. There are other countries such as Uganda that have been proposed to be included in the upcoming BRICS. So the counterbalance is BRICS is likely to be much more influential. But the question is, does BRICS have the financial and the political weight to fill the space that will be left by a declining G20? It still remains to be seen. And I know the debate is whether BRICS is really a substantial financial power or is it just symbolic political power to counter the US. It's still a bit debatable.
Paris, is Africa ready for this unpredictable shift?
For Africa, I don't know if it's ready. For Africa, I don't know if it's ready.
The question of readiness is an interesting one. My personal view is that whether it's BRICS or G20, these are still institutions that are controlled by the big powers, either the US or China. So whether Africa aligns itself towards the east or the west, they will still be dancing to the tune largely set by the dominant powers. The solution for Africa is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. That is the only organization where Africa is likely to have influence in terms of shaping their agenda. So rather than look east or west, Africa should be really looking at themselves. How can they bolster and strengthen the African Continental Free Trade Area, build African institutions that are genuinely African, controlled by Africans, promoting an African agenda, and putting money, all right, where their mouth is, so that they can strengthen their reliance on themselves. But East or West is not going to be a solution.
Okay, Doctor, do you think now, because we have seen the Secretaries of State, Besant, you know, he's the one who is in charge of the Finance Ministry and did not attend that meeting. Does it mean because the agenda of the G20 summit is the matter of distribution of the finances, so what is going to happen to this G20 in terms of financial distribution? Because Besant was not available, he did not attend the meeting.
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually the way that the G20 works is that the country that is in charge of the rotational presidency sets the agenda.
Yes.
For instance, we saw that other than the general agenda for the G20, when it was the chairmanship of Brazil, President Lula set up this Global Alliance for Hunger and Poverty, for instance, as their pet initiative. When it was the role of India, they decided that including Africa would be the signature contribution of India in the G20. Now, South Africa now has to set the agenda for the G20 and try to work with the ministers initially of foreign affairs and trade of the, and finance of the other countries to rally them around South Africa's agenda. South Africa's agenda is fairly threefold. One is enhanced climate financing, so that the rich countries can contribute more to the climate financing to help African countries. The other one is equity in terms of debt relief, that Africa is facing a rising debt burden. What can the G20 do? Because this has been done in the past. There was a debt relief mechanism where a few African countries benefited. So that is the other agenda. And generally global equity and reform of global financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, that are perceived not to really favor African countries. So this is the agenda of South Africa. Now, first you have to agree on the agenda, you have to agree on the targets before you put the money behind it. Now with the US not participating at all, it can have a positive or negative effect. The participating countries can have more freedom without the US bias to agree on a common agenda. So that always helps when you have fewer hands on the table. The question then is, what will be the outcome of this agreed agenda if you have to put money into it, if you have to put money into climate financing, into debt relief, and so on and so forth, without the US? Will the other countries have a meaningful impact on these agreements? So that remains to be seen.
Thank you so much, both Dr. and Paris, for gracing our interview today. And that concludes our bulletin today. Be sure to tune in tomorrow, same place, same time at 1 p.m. as we debug global diplomacy and geopolitics. I have been your ambassador, Susan Nganga. Good afternoon.